front. The next speaker will be Professor Jonathan, and I invite Professor Jonathan to make his presentation.
Before I begin, I want to go ahead and I'll preface my presentation with two comments. The first one is I want to thank the organizers of the conference for a very warm and albeit very wet introduction on my first visit to Sri Lanka. I've had nothing but positive experiences so far, and I hope to have more in the coming days ahead. The second thing I want to say is I notice there's a fair number of students in the audience, some of you taking notes, some of you not. I'm going to exercise my professorial prerogative and issue you a quiz at the end of the session today, and maybe it will count towards your graduation. Okay, so pay attention. All right. So the discussion I wanted to have today was stimulated by a statement that was written on September 20th of 2013. There we go. A statement on September 20th, 2013, written by a former Prime Minister of New Zealand and current administrator of the United Nations Development Program, Helen Clark. And she had written an article in The Guardian UK basically making an assertion that stability needed to be at the core of development, particularly as we transition from the Millennium Development Goals to the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals. And I wanted to issue a cautionary note on this. And today, hopefully, you can sort of follow my line of reasoning. That anytime we have discussions about the need for stability and development, that it has historically been used by some regimes to go ahead and justify the suppression of human rights. And generally, the line of reasoning, at least as found by most scholars on human rights, is that stability is something that's seen by the state as necessary for social order. So in which case the state then takes it as an excuse to go ahead and to use it as a justification to suppress activities that are deemed a threat to the social order. And as a result, you get a situation where you get a suppression of human rights. And it results in sort of a paradox. At least it potentially leads to a paradox where a United Nations call for stability ends up being a threat to the United Nations system of human rights. And so my question was, well, how do you get around this? Okay, particularly when we deal with a special case of civil disobedience, which, as you'll see in a few minutes, produces a particular threat to the state. Now, the defense that's typically raised is that within the past 20 to 30 years, that there's been a trend towards democracies, right? But here, too, there's a bit of a cautionary note because there's a certain line of democracy scholarship that notes that a lot of the democracies that have arisen within the past 20 years are what are called defective, or to use the academic parlance, illiberal democracies. And they may be democracies in terms of institutions, in terms of processes, but they don't seem to be democracies in terms of respecting human rights. So in other words, they're democracies in name only, and they certainly don't have the soul of a democracy, right? And so I would, the postulate that exists is that a democracy that has no soul is a democracy that is meaningless. All right, so what I wanted to do is to sort of resolve this paradox by referencing some of the insights from U.S. history. Most people don't know it, but within American constitutional history, as the United States Constitution was going through ratification in 1787, 1788, there was an ongoing debate over the exact same issues that the United Nations has sort of raised now. The question about the need for stability versus a desire to respect civil liberties, aka human rights. And so here I have two quotes. One is from the Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas, and who argued and asserted, by the way, in a tract that I recommend everyone read if they're curious about this topic. It was published in 1968 and it's titled Civil Disobedience. And in that tract, Abe Fortas recognizes that a state may defend its existence and its functions, and the state may and must protect its citizens. All right. Then you have Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States, who himself also then said, must a government of necessity be too strong for the liberties of its own people or too weak to maintain its own existence? All right. So the debate that occurred in terms of the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, it was between the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were represented by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. The Anti-Federalists, the major writer was Robert Yates. All right. And so there was a bit of a tension between the two sides in terms of like what it was that government was supposed to do and how far government can go to go ahead and maintain order with respect to civil liberties. So on the side of the Federalists, the argument there was that you did not want dissent. Okay, dissent was dangerous. All right. Alexander Hamilton, in particular, said that if you had dissent, that it caused divisions in society. Okay, so you have divisions in society, it results in factions. And both he and Madison were of the mind that if you had a mass population that was driven by faction, you had a population that was driven more by passion than they were by reason. Right? And so the result was ultimately revolution and a breakdown in society. Okay, something that's very problematic. In contrast to that, you had the Anti-Federalists who argued that they recognized that a government, any government, has a purpose to maintain laws, to maintain order. But their response was that there are certain core liberties, certain human rights that you cannot surrender to the state. Okay, the government must protect these. Ultimately, the compromise that was reached in 1788 went something like this. Okay, so James Madison was the architect of the compromise. James Madison began by saying, look, all right, we need to eliminate faction. We need to be careful about controlling dissent. All right. Now, how do you do it? All right. It is possible that you can eliminate dissent by eliminating liberty altogether. You force a population to be homogenous. James Madison then said, but this is a problem. If you're a democratic society that supposedly fights for liberty, okay, that grounds its creation in the arguments of liberty, then you're basically antithetical to yourself. Right? Second thing that Madison said was that if you're a society that believes that diversity is a resource, that you want to have a population with diverse abilities, then it's contrary to your own interest to try and suppress dissent. Right? The third thing that Madison also argued was that it's impracticable for any government to try and impose a uniformity to suppress all dissent, just as a matter of the time, the resources, and the personnel that are required to do that. So what Hamilton and Madison proposed, and what ultimately passed, as you can see in the structure of the United States government, is that you would limit the implications of faction. You would limit the dangers of division by trying to have representative government. So it would be ruled by elites that supposedly or presumably were driven more by reason than they were by passion. All right. The reason this is a compromise, though, is that James Madison then also adopted the anti-federalist position. It was one of the supreme ironies of history that James Madison ultimately enumerated the rights that were articulated by the anti-federalists, and that's what the United States is called the Bill of Rights, that these are certain rights for which there is a presumption that the government cannot violate those rights. Now, I mentioned to you, for those of you who are students, that there would be a quiz at the end of the session, and I want you to remember this page, all right? Because we'll pick up on this at the end of my talk today. All right. Now, beyond U.S. history, there's also philosophical and practical reasons as to why it is that you might want to justify or allow dissent in a developing country. And here you can sort of trace the U.S. position, the U.S. history, to sort of some philosophical origins. And in the Federalist, anti-Federalist debates, they grounded their arguments and their discussions in three major bodies of jurisprudence. So there was the natural law tradition, the utilitarian tradition, and then the liberal tradition. And you can see the natural law tradition in the U.S. history when they talk about stuff like inalienable rights, natural rights. And what they're doing here is that they're referencing this idea that there are certain rights that exist independent of humans. Their laws are not social constructs, and human rights are not social constructs, that there are certain kinds of rights that exist within human beings because they're human. You can either come from some divine origin, or you can ascertain them from the natural world. Right? The utilitarian position argues that rights exist because they provide benefits to the political life and the social life of a society that outweigh the costs of trying to suppress those rights. Okay? And the costs are in terms of, again, time, personnel resources. All right. And then there's a liberal tradition, and you can see this reflected in the language and history where they talk about stuff like human dignity, the dignity of human nature, the dignity of the human character. And this is, the reasoning behind here is that every human being has a certain minimum level of individual dignity and a certain level of individual autonomy. And in order to be able to, for all humans to be equal, that means all humans must have dignity and autonomy. All right. Now, going beyond the philosophical discussions, there are also practical reasons as to why we would want to consider allowing dissent in any society. And so I drew upon 3 bodies of theory. This is all coming within the past 20 to 30 years that there's been scholarship in areas. That's the phenomenon called groupthink. There's scholarship in a phenomenon called confirmation bias. And then there's also literature that's ongoing right now, sort of the cutting edge stuff that deals with social networks. And this is, they talk about the phenomenon of homophilia. All right. So they talk about groupthink. The argument here is that in leadership circles and decision-making circles, sometimes you get a dysfunctional atmosphere wherein there is a pressure for consensus. And sometimes the pressure for consensus is so great that it suppresses dissent. Now, the consequence of this and the danger of groupthink is that it results in a lack of critical analysis and an unwillingness to consider possible mistakes, that the leaders don't seem to be able to comprehend that sometimes it is possible for people to make mistakes, that in order for you to recognize that you are making a mistake, you have to be willing to accept a dissenting opinion or a dissenting viewpoint. And so the disasters or mistakes that are sort of alluded to in the scholarship, particularly by Janus, they talk about the U.S. involvement in the Bay of Pigs, that the Kennedy administration suffered from groupthink, and you ended up with the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Then there was the Johnson administration, the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and that for whatever reason, most outsiders outside of the Johnson administration realized that an escalation of the United States military in Vietnam posed huge consequences for U.S. society as a whole, and also huge consequences for U.S. foreign policy. But for whatever reason, within the administration, they seem to think of no recourse but to keep escalating the U.S. troop strength in Vietnam. And then the last example was Nixon and Watergate, that for whatever reason outside the administration, it seemed to be common knowledge that breaking and entering into a hotel room to steal information about the opposing political candidate was a violation of the law. But yet within the Nixon administration, that kind of realization or that kind of discussion never occurred. All right. Second phenomenon is this thing called confirmation bias. And in this situation, you have an environment where it's very much belief-driven, and there's a desire to confirm the beliefs. And so the danger is that you as a decision maker will only accept information that correlates or corresponds or confirms what you believe. Now, again, the danger of this is that you get a very distorted vision of reality. You don't seem to be willing to process information that conflicts with your sense of what is right, in which case you're never forced to question what it is that what you believe. And so the kinds of dysfunctions and historical examples that are, this was raised by Sutherland, was the U.S. Navy in its response to Pearl Harbor. Historical research has found that the U.S. Navy actually had intelligence of the Japanese movements against Pearl Harbor in 1941, but for whatever reason, the U.S.